The battle had raged for hours. Explosions shook the ground beneath Dr. Ethan Hayes' feet as he ran through the thick, smoky air of the war-torn landscape. He wasn't a soldier, he was a medic. But in the middle of a war between Earth and the Crevellan Dominion, everyone had their role to play, even if it meant getting their hands dirty. Ethan's team had been tasked with helping evacuate the wounded, but the chaos was overwhelming. Crevellan forces, with their advanced weaponry and technology, had easily pushed Earth's defenses back, and now the human soldiers were retreating, desperately trying to survive. But Ethan wasn't concerned about retreating. His mind raced with the sole thought of saving lives. The medics had done all they could for the soldiers, but there were still civilians out there, survivors of the invasion, and Ethan couldn't leave without checking on them. He moved swiftly, his boots crunching over the rubble as he passed the remains of a ruined building. The distant sounds of gunfire echoed in the background, but Ethan's focus remained sharp. His medical pack was heavy on his back, but it was essential. He knew the risks of wandering so far behind enemy lines, but this was his job. He couldn't just ignore those in need, no matter who they were. That was when he saw her. Lying on the ground, her body half hidden beneath a tangle of debris, was an alien. She wasn't just any Crevellan soldier. Her armor was different, sleek, almost regal, with designs that made her stand out from the rest of the Crevellan army. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the blood pooling around her, bright red, staining the earth beneath her. Without hesitation, Ethan rushed over. His training kicked in, and he immediately knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Her breathing was shallow, and her pulse was weak but still there. The princess, he thought. This must be the daughter of King Zorathar, the tyrant who had led the Crevellan Dominion's invasion of Earth. "Stay with me," Ethan muttered, gently checking the severity of her injuries. She was bleeding from a deep gash on her side, and her leg was bent at an unnatural angle. There was no time to waste. He had to act fast. But just as he was about to administer first aid, the sound of footsteps echoed through the wreckage. Panic gripped his chest. He couldn't be caught with a Crevellan princess. The last thing he needed was to be executed for helping the enemy. He grabbed his medkit and quickly scanned the area. He needed to hide her. There was a small alcove nearby, a half-collapsed building that could provide temporary cover. Ethan hoisted the princess onto his shoulder with as much care as he could muster, his muscles screaming under the strain. The pain in his own body was ignored in the face of the urgency of the situation. As he ducked into the dark space, the sound of the Crevellan patrol grew louder. They were close. His heart raced as he pressed himself against the cold stone, trying to make as little noise as possible. He held his breath, praying that they wouldn't find him. A group of Crevellan soldiers passed by, their voices harsh and cold, speaking in their alien language. Ethan dared not make a sound. The princess was still unconscious in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder. He felt the weight of the moment, the risk of his actions. If he was caught, it would be the end of him. No one would understand why he was helping the enemy. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps faded, and the soldiers moved on. Ethan let out a long, silent breath of relief. But his work wasn't over. He needed to stabilize the princess before he could think about escaping. He gently lowered her to the ground, careful not to aggravate her injuries. He quickly began working on stopping the bleeding, applying bandages with practiced speed. The advanced medical techniques he had learned back on Earth were nothing compared to what the Crevellan technology could provide, but he was determined to do what he could with the little he had. Ethan checked the princess's pulse again. It was weak, but there. He quickly scanned her body for other injuries. He noticed that her breathing was labored, and there was a faint shimmer beneath her armor, something metallic, hidden beneath the surface. It looked like a cloaking device. It was sophisticated, beyond anything Earth had, and it made him wonder just how important this woman was. She wasn't just any princess. She was the daughter of King Zorathar, the man who had started the war that had devastated so many lives. She had to be. Her armor was unlike the standard Crevellan gear, and the device she was wearing, well, it was reserved for only the most important of their kind. Ethan could feel a gnawing doubt growing in his chest. Why had she been left behind? What had happened? And more importantly, why had the Crevellan soldiers failed to finish the job? Did they know who she was? His thoughts were interrupted by the faintest movement. The princess stirred slightly, her eyelids flickering open. Her eyes, the color of deep violet, locked onto Ethan's face. For a moment, she just stared at him, her expression cold and calculating, before her lips parted. "Why, are you helping me?" Her voice was weak, but there was an undeniable authority in her tone. Ethan froze. He had to answer her question. But how? What was he supposed to say? He was a human, in the middle of an alien invasion, helping the daughter of the enemy king. He was a medic, just a medic, but somehow, here he was, defying every instinct to survive and help her. Why? Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm just trying to save you. I couldn't just leave you to die." She frowned, her brows knitting in confusion. "You are a human." "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice soft but steady. "I'm a human. And I'm trying to help you." The princess didn't speak for a moment, but the distrust in her eyes was palpable. She was a Crevellan, raised to see humanity as nothing more than an obstacle in their quest for domination. She had every reason to view him with suspicion, yet there was something else in her gaze, a flicker of something he couldn't quite read. Maybe it was pain, or maybe it was curiosity. "I'm Princess Velrith," she said, her voice stronger now, despite the weakness in her body. "Daughter of King Zorathar. You shouldn't be helping me." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The princess. The rebel. She was the key to everything, the reason the Crevellans had invaded Earth in the first place. And here she was, lying in front of him, injured, helpless. He had always heard of her, rumors, whispers in the ranks of soldiers. The Crevellan princess who didn't agree with her father's methods, the one who had once tried to overthrow him. But no one had ever expected her to be left behind. Her rebellion was a story, a legend, but now it was real. "You don't understand," Ethan said. "I'm just trying to save you. You're important." Her eyes narrowed. "Important? To whom?" "To everyone," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "To Earth. To the galaxy." Princess Velrith stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, before she closed her eyes, exhausted. "I have to stop him. I have to stop my father." Ethan nodded. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, it was clear that helping this alien princess might just be the key to ending this war and saving his world. But for now, all he could do was keep her alive. And pray that he wasn't making the worst mistake of his life. Ethan sat beside the unconscious princess, his mind racing. The alien princess, Velrith, was still in critical condition, but he couldn't leave her. He had promised to help her, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. He knew he was taking a huge risk. The Crevellan forces would never forgive him for saving the daughter of their king, and if they found out, they would kill him without hesitation. But Ethan had made his choice. His hands were shaking as he finished the last of the bandaging. His first aid training wasn't enough to treat someone of her species, but he did what he could with the limited supplies he had. The princess had lost a lot of blood, and her breathing was still uneven, but she was alive. That was all that mattered for now. As he worked, he couldn't stop thinking about the situation he was in. A human medic, alone with an alien princess in the middle of a war zone. It seemed insane, but somehow, it felt right. Ethan had always been the kind of person to help, no matter the cost. It was who he was. But helping Velrith would cost him more than he could ever imagine. The Crevellan forces would be searching for her, and if they found her with him, there was no way he would survive. His loyalty to Earth and his duty as a medic would be tested like never before. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the occasional distant explosion. Ethan checked her pulse again. It was still weak but steady. He couldn't let his guard down. The Crevellan forces were always close. His heart raced as he thought about what might happen if they found him. They would execute him without hesitation. But what if he could get Velrith to safety? What if her knowledge could help them win this war? That thought filled him with a strange sense of hope. Velrith wasn't like the other Crevellans. She was different. He could see it in her eyes when she had first woken up, a flicker of defiance, of rebellion against her father's empire. She had tried to overthrow King Zorathar, her own father, a brutal and merciless ruler. Ethan could see that. There was something in her that wasn't like the others. She wasn't the typical enemy. And yet, she was still his enemy. The Crevellan Empire had invaded Earth, killing thousands, and they showed no signs of stopping. Ethan had lost friends in this war, and countless civilians had perished in the wake of the Crevellan invasion. How could he forget that? How could he help someone like her? But as he sat there, watching over Velrith, the weight of that question began to lift. She wasn't just another soldier. She wasn't just the daughter of the man who had caused all this destruction. She was someone who wanted to change things, someone who hated the way her people ruled. And maybe, just maybe, she could help turn the tide of the war. The more he thought about it, the more Ethan realized that this was bigger than just saving a life. This was about humanity's survival, about taking a stand against an oppressive force that threatened to wipe out everything he knew. Velrith might be the key to that change. But as the hours ticked by, the dangers continued to mount. The longer he stayed hidden with her, the more likely it was that Crevellan patrols would find them. He had to move her, and fast. He had no idea where to go, but he couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. Ethan gently shook Velritha's shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her expression still filled with confusion and distrust. She clearly remembered their last conversation. "What are you going to do with me?" she asked hoarsely, her voice still weak but gaining strength. Her eyes were full of suspicion, but also a hint of curiosity. She seemed to realize that her survival depended on Ethan's decision. "I'm not going to kill you," Ethan replied firmly. "But I can't just leave you here. The Crevellan forces will find you, and if they do, they won't hesitate to kill you." Velritha's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. Ethan could see that she didn't fully trust him, but something in her softened, just a little. "Where will we go?" she asked. Ethan paused, looking out at the horizon. The war was raging on all around them. They couldn't just walk into any of the human strongholds. They would be spotted immediately. But there was a place, an old underground base that his team had used before, a secret location that was off the radar of the Crevellan forces. It was risky, but it was their best chance. "There's a base," Ethan said slowly. "It's a long shot, but it's the only place we can go. I know it's dangerous, but we need to move." Velrith nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "You expect me to trust you? You, a human, who has been fighting against my people all this time?" Ethan hesitated. This was the hardest part, the part that made everything feel like it could fall apart in an instant. "I'm not fighting against your people," he said quietly. "I'm fighting against the people who have taken everything from us. I don't know why you want to stop your father, but if you're willing to fight him, then I'm willing to help." Velrith seemed to study him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's go. But know this, if you betray me, I will not hesitate to kill you." Ethan nodded. He didn't expect anything less. The Crevellans were a ruthless species, and Velrith had been raised in that environment. But she wasn't like the others. There was something in her that made him believe she was different. With that, Ethan helped Velrith to her feet. Her leg was still badly injured, but she managed to stand with his support. She winced in pain, but she didn't complain. Together, they began moving through the war-torn landscape, careful to avoid any Crevellan patrols. The journey wasn't easy. Every step felt like it could be their last. Ethan was constantly on high alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy. But the real challenge was not just the danger outside, it was the tension between him and Velrith. She had no reason to trust him, and he knew that. But the more they traveled together, the more he saw her true nature. She wasn't just a princess, she was a fighter, and a leader in her own right. She had no intention of going back to her father, and she was willing to risk everything to stop him. As they traveled deeper into enemy territory, Ethan began to understand why. She wasn't just trying to stop the Crevellan Empire from conquering Earth, she was fighting for a chance at peace, for the possibility of a future where her people weren't enslaving others. But there was something else too. Velrith had a deep anger inside her, a rage at her father for everything he had done. He had used her, manipulated her, and she had spent years fighting back against him. She had even tried to kill him once. Ethan could see that in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting for Earth, she was fighting for herself. For her own freedom. And now, she was fighting alongside him. A human. Ethan had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't back out now. They pressed on, each step bringing them closer to the secret base, but they knew that time was running out. The Crevellan forces were closing in, and they would have to face whatever dangers awaited them. Together, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like they might actually have a chance. Every step they took brought them closer to the unknown, but also, to the possibility of victory. And for the first time in a long time, that thought gave Ethan hope. The journey was grueling. Every step Ethan and Velrith took felt like they were racing against time, each moment bringing them closer to danger. They were out in the open, on enemy territory, far from any safe zone. The Crevellan forces were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they realized that the princess was missing. The Crevellans had a vast network of surveillance and patrols, and their hunting efficiency was unmatched. Ethan's thoughts were consumed with worry, but he focused on the task at hand. They had to keep moving. The terrain was hostile, filled with jagged rocks and craters, evidence of the bombardments that had ravaged the planet. The air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to breathe, and the stench of burning buildings hung in the air. It wasn't just a battlefield, it was a wasteland, scarred by war. Velritha's condition was still serious. Despite the bandages and makeshift splints Ethan had applied, she was weak, and her wounds hadn't healed. Her leg was still swollen and painful, making it hard for her to walk without support. Ethan did his best to assist her, but there was only so much he could do. She had insisted on moving forward, refusing to stay behind or rest. He understood her determination, but he also knew that pushing herself too hard would only make things worse. They didn't speak much as they made their way through the desolate landscape. There was an awkward silence between them, the kind that only comes when two people, once enemies, are forced to rely on each other for survival. The tension was palpable. Velritha's eyes often flicked toward Ethan, filled with suspicion, as though she was wondering if this fragile alliance would last. Ethan couldn't blame her for being cautious. After all, he was a human, someone who had fought against her people for so long. And yet, here they were, walking side by side, trying to survive in a world that seemed to want to tear them apart. His mind kept going back to that one moment when he'd chosen to save her. He had no idea why he did it, only that it felt like the right thing to do. Maybe it was the look in her eyes when she woke up, the flicker of defiance that he had seen in her before. Or maybe it was because, in some strange way, he could relate to her. They were both caught in a war that neither of them wanted. He was fighting to protect humanity, and she was fighting against her father's brutal rule. But as much as he wanted to believe they could work together, Ethan couldn't forget the reality of the situation. The Crevellan forces were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they found Velrith. And when they did, they wouldn't care who was helping her. They would wipe out everyone in their path, including Ethan. The worst part was that Ethan didn't even know what to do with Velrith. He had no plan. He had no backup. He had no idea if this uneasy alliance would lead to anything good. All he knew was that they couldn't stay out in the open for long. They needed to find shelter and keep moving toward the base. As they trudged through the rocky terrain, Velrith finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Do you ever wonder why you're doing this?" Her voice was weak but edged with a strange calmness. "You're helping me. A Crevellan. A princess of the very empire that invaded your world." Ethan glanced at her, unsure of how to answer. He had wondered that himself. But the words came to him, simple and honest. "I'm not helping you because you're a Crevellan," he said quietly. "I'm helping you because you're not like the others. You don't want this war. You want to stop your father." Velrith didn't respond at first. She seemed to be processing his words, but her expression remained unreadable. Then, she spoke again. "Why do you care? Why should it matter to you?" Ethan stopped walking for a moment and looked down at her. "Because I believe in a future where people don't have to fight like this. Where we can all live in peace. I know it sounds impossible, but if we don't fight for that, then what are we fighting for?" Velrith didn't answer, but the way she looked at him seemed to shift, just slightly. She wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. There was something else there, something that resembled understanding, or maybe just acceptance. It was the first sign that their alliance, fragile as it was, might have a chance of surviving. But the peace didn't last long. The distant sound of heavy boots crunching over the rocks cut through the quiet, shattering the brief moment of connection. Ethan's heart sank. They were close, too close. He had heard the Crevellan patrols before, and they were relentless in their search. They couldn't be spotted, not now. "Hide," Ethan whispered urgently, grabbing Velritha's arm and pulling her behind a large boulder. They crouched low, holding their breaths as the sound of footsteps grew nearer. Ethan's eyes darted around, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Velritha's breathing was shallow, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized just how vulnerable they were. He had no idea how they could escape, no idea what they would do if the patrol discovered them. The footsteps stopped. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, his palms sweating. He glanced at Velrith, who was staring ahead, her eyes narrowing in concentration. He held his breath. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either fall apart or they would survive. The patrol was just around the corner, so close Ethan could hear their voices. They spoke in their harsh Crevellan language, but he could make out a few words. They were searching for a missing princess. The urgency in their voices made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they found her. Ethan's grip on Velritha's arm tightened, and he tried to calm his breathing. If they were caught, there was no way out. It was all over. Seconds passed like hours, and then, finally, the footsteps began to fade. The patrol had moved on. Ethan slowly released the breath he had been holding. He couldn't believe they had made it through without being spotted. His heart was still racing, and his body was tense, but they had survived another close call. Velrith, on the other hand, didn't seem fazed. Her expression was cold, distant, and even though she was still weak, there was something in her that made her seem far more dangerous than Ethan had originally thought. She had grown up in this world of danger, and it had hardened her. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that had gripped them both moments before. "If we stay here much longer, they'll find us." Ethan nodded, his thoughts scattered. He couldn't help but feel a strange respect for Velrith. She was still a princess, an enemy, but she was also someone who had the strength to survive in a world that seemed designed to break her. They continued their journey, silently this time, as the weight of their alliance began to sink in. They had formed a tenuous bond, one born out of necessity, but maybe, just maybe, it would become something more. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered. The road ahead was dangerous, and the Crevellan forces were closing in, but Ethan couldn't help but feel like there was a chance. A chance for something better. A chance for peace. But that hope was fragile. And it would take more than just the two of them to fight for it. Ethan's eyes darted around the dark, crumbling building they had taken shelter in. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the ground was littered with debris. It was a far cry from the underground base they had been aiming for, but it would have to do. They were exhausted, their energy running low, and Velritha's condition was growing worse. Every step she took seemed to drain her more. The pain in her leg was unbearable, and despite the makeshift bandages, the injury wasn't healing. Ethan had no choice but to keep moving, hoping they could make it to the base before it was too late. They had been traveling for days, moving from one hideout to another, avoiding Crevellan patrols and trying to stay out of sight. Each moment felt like it could be their last, and Ethan was starting to feel the weight of the situation. They were still a long way from the base, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. But as much as he wanted to push forward, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at him. Something didn't feel right. Velrith had been quiet for the past few hours, her mind clearly occupied with something other than their survival. She had grown more distant as the days passed, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder if she was starting to regret her decision to trust him. He couldn't blame her. They were from two completely different worlds, with no reason to trust each other, and yet here they were, relying on one another for survival. As he sat down beside her, Ethan noticed that she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, her eyes narrowed as if she was deep in thought. He was about to speak when she suddenly turned to face him, her expression cold and unreadable. "Ethan," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a weight he hadn't heard before. "I need to tell you something." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The way she said his name, the way she looked at him, it wasn't the same as before. He had no idea what was coming, but he had a sinking feeling in his gut. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," Velrith continued, her eyes never leaving his. "About why I'm here, why I'm helping you. And I've realized something." Ethan swallowed hard. "What have you realized?" Velritha's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You're not the only one with a plan, Ethan. You've been trusting me, thinking that I'm just a princess trying to escape my father's empire. But I'm not as innocent as you think." Ethan felt his stomach drop. He had suspected something like this, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel real. He tried to keep his voice steady, though the fear was creeping into his tone. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Velrith leaned in slightly, her eyes glinting with a strange mixture of sadness and something else, something darker. "I've been playing you, Ethan. I never needed your help to escape my father. I didn't need you to treat my wounds. I needed you to get me close to the humans." Ethan's mind spun. He had been so focused on keeping her alive, so determined to believe that she was on his side, that he hadn't seen the truth. Velrith wasn't just a princess, she was a player in a much bigger game, and he had been nothing more than a pawn. For a moment, all Ethan could do was stare at her, shocked into silence. He had risked his life for her, trusted her with everything. And now, she was telling him that it had all been a lie. "You're working with the Crevellan forces?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Velrith shook her head. "No. I'm not working with my father. But I had to get close to you. To see if the humans were really as strong as they claimed. And I needed to know what you knew about the Crevellan resistance. About your plans to overthrow my father." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. He had been a fool to think that someone like Velrith could just switch sides. But she had never been like the others. She was a ruler's daughter, born into a world of power and manipulation. Of course, she had a plan of her own. He had seen the way she had fought her father's empire, the fire in her eyes, but he had underestimated her. "I didn't expect you to betray me," Ethan said slowly, his words tinged with disbelief. I thought we were in this together. I thought we were fighting the same fight." Velrith sighed, her expression softening for the first time. "I didn't want to betray you, Ethan. But I had to do what I had to do. The Crevellan Empire is my blood. My father is a tyrant, and I'm the only one who can stop him. I can't do that without knowing everything about your people's plans. Without understanding what you're willing to sacrifice." Ethan's heart was heavy. It felt like the ground beneath him had crumbled. He had been fooled, tricked by someone he thought he could trust. But as much as it hurt, he knew deep down that it wasn't over yet. There was still a chance. A chance for them to put aside their differences and work together. But first, he had to understand what Velrith really wanted. "So, what now?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but firm. "What do you want from me?" Velritha's eyes darkened. "I want to know everything about your resistance. Your plans to fight my father. I want to know what you'll do to stop him. And then we'll see if there's any room for negotiation. For peace." Ethan stared at her, conflicted. He wanted to hate her for what she had done. For using him. But there was still something in her eyes that made him hesitate. She wasn't like the others. She had the power to change everything, but she needed help. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to work together. He couldn't turn his back on that. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Velrith," he said softly. "But I'll give you what you want. I'll tell you everything." Velritha's gaze softened, a hint of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Ethan. I promise you won't regret it." But as the words left her lips, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Something wasn't right. The feeling of betrayal lingered, but so did a strange sense of hope. Maybe she wasn't the enemy after all. Maybe she could still be the ally they needed. The silence between them was heavy, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was a moment of truth, a turning point. There was no going back now. As they sat there, a quiet realization began to settle in. Betrayal had come, but with it, there was a chance for redemption. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was one they had to walk together. For now, at least, they were allies, though how long that would last, neither of them could say. Ethan had learned the hard way that not everything was as it seemed. But as long as there was hope, however small, there was a chance for something better. And maybe, just maybe, that hope would be enough to carry them both through the dark days ahead. The final battle was fast approaching. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like the smoke from the battlefield. His every step felt like it could be his last. They had reached the base, the last stronghold of the human resistance, where they would make their final stand against the Crevellan Empire. And yet, as they prepared for the inevitable conflict, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The uneasy alliance he had formed with Velrith hung in the balance. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, but he also couldn't afford to turn his back on her now. The rebellion had been planning this attack for months. The humans had prepared their forces, mobilizing every soldier and every resource they could muster. Ethan, despite being a medic, had been pulled into the heart of the action. He had treated countless injuries, helped coordinate evacuations, and now, as the final battle loomed, he had to face the reality that they might all die here. Velrith had kept her distance in the days leading up to the battle. She had been quiet, her eyes lost in thought. There was a part of him that still didn't trust her. After all, she had betrayed him once, using him as a pawn in her own game. But there was something in her demeanor now that made Ethan wonder. She had been in the Crevellan Empire long enough to know how to fight. She knew how to survive. And right now, that was what they needed. As the first wave of Crevellan forces approached, the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. The human resistance was ready. They had the element of surprise, and they had the will to fight. But as the Crevellan warships appeared in the sky, Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. The Crevellan forces were powerful, and even with their preparations, the humans were outnumbered. "Ethan, we have to move," Velrith said, her voice sharp with urgency. Her eyes were scanning the horizon, her posture tense. "The first wave is coming. You need to get to the medical bay and prepare the soldiers. I'll stay here and make sure the enemy doesn't get too close." Ethan hesitated, looking at her. There was no sign of the betrayal from before, but the doubt in his heart remained. Could he really trust her? Despite everything, he had to. The battle was already here, and they didn't have time to question every decision. They had to act. "I'll go," Ethan said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "But be careful, Velrith. I don't want to lose you." She gave him a quick, almost imperceptible nod before turning back to face the advancing Crevellan forces. Ethan felt his heart heavy as he made his way toward the medical bay. The resistance needed him, and he couldn't afford to fail them now. The medical bay was chaotic, filled with wounded soldiers who had already been caught in the early skirmishes. Ethan did what he could, moving from one patient to the next, his hands moving quickly and efficiently, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew that the final battle was just beginning. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope. It was about creating a future for humanity, one that didn't involve constant war, one where they could finally live in peace. But peace felt so far away, like an impossible dream. The Crevellans had built their empire on the backs of countless worlds, and now they were at humanity's doorstep. Ethan couldn't afford to lose this battle. Not when everything was on the line. Outside, the sound of the first explosions rattled the walls of the medical bay. The Crevellan forces had arrived, their massive warships hovering above the base, raining down fire on the resistance below. Ethan didn't have time to think about the larger strategy. He had to focus on the here and now. There were soldiers out there who needed him. As the battle raged outside, the ground shook beneath Ethan's feet. The Crevellan forces had begun their assault, pushing forward with overwhelming force. It wasn't just their technology that made them a formidable enemy, it was their sheer will to conquer. The Crevellans didn't know how to lose. But Ethan and the humans had something that they didn't: hope, determination, and the desire to fight for their freedom. Velrith was out there somewhere, fighting for her own reasons. Ethan had no idea if she was still with the humans or if she had turned against them again. But for now, he couldn't worry about that. The battle was too important. The sound of gunfire echoed through the base as Ethan moved through the corridors, checking on the injured. He found himself at the front lines in no time, his medical supplies in hand. The soldiers were doing their best to hold their ground, but the Crevellan forces were relentless, pushing forward with an overwhelming number of troops. Ethan's heart pounded as he treated the wounded, knowing that every moment counted. He couldn't afford to waste time. The humans had to win, or they would be crushed under the might of the Crevellan Empire. Suddenly, a loud explosion shook the ground, and the lights flickered out. The base was in chaos, soldiers scrambling for cover as the Crevellan forces broke through the perimeter. Ethan's pulse raced as he looked around. The enemy was closing in, and the human resistance was starting to falter. He had to act fast. "Velrith!" Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse as he scanned the battlefield. He had no idea where she was, but he couldn't fight this alone. They needed each other. Just as he was about to move, a figure appeared in front of him. It was Velrith, covered in dust and blood, her eyes fierce and determined. She was holding a weapon in one hand, her other hand pressed against her side where blood was seeping through her torn clothing. "We have to push forward, Ethan," she said, her voice strained but full of conviction. "We can't stop now. If we don't take control of the Central Command Center, we'll lose everything." Ethan nodded, his fear momentarily forgotten as he followed her, knowing that they had no other choice. This was it, the final push. They had to take down the Crevellan forces before they could regroup and launch a full-scale assault on the humans. The two of them fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other growing despite everything that had happened. With each step, the resistance gained ground, pushing back the Crevellan forces inch by inch. But it wasn't enough. The Crevellans were relentless, and the tide of battle shifted back and forth with every passing minute. The Central Command Center was in sight. They were so close, but the Crevellans had dug in their heels, and the humans were beginning to run out of options. Explosions rocked the ground around them as the fight escalated to a fever pitch. Ethan's heart raced in his chest. They couldn't afford to let up. Velrith was beside him, her eyes steely with determination. She didn't flinch as another blast sent debris flying across the battlefield. She was a warrior, a leader in her own right, and as they pushed forward together, Ethan realized something. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayals and the doubts, Velrith was fighting for something more than herself. She was fighting for freedom. They reached the command center, and with a final, explosive push, the Crevellan forces began to retreat. The resistance had done it, they had won. As the dust settled and the smoke began to clear, Ethan and Velrith stood side by side, exhausted but victorious. The final battle had been won, but the cost had been high. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, both human and Crevellan. And though they had secured a hard-fought victory, Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The war was far from over. Velrith turned to Ethan, her face bruised but a proud smile on her lips. "We did it," she said softly. Ethan didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked out over the battlefield, his thoughts heavy. The war had been won, but the future was still uncertain. However, for the first time in a long time, there was hope. There was a chance for peace. And that, Ethan realized, was worth everything. The final battle had ended, but the fight for a better future was just beginning. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. The smoke from the explosion still hung in the air, and the silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood in the middle of the battlefield, looking around at the aftermath. The resistance had managed to win, but at a high cost. Bodies of both human soldiers and Crevellan soldiers littered the ground, their blood mixing with the dust and dirt. The victory, while hard-earned, felt hollow in the face of so much loss. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the past few days. Everything had happened so fast. He had been a medic, someone who had always been on the sidelines of war, helping the injured and providing care. But now, he had become part of something much bigger than he ever imagined. The rebellion had fought not just for survival, but for a future where they could finally live in peace, free from the oppressive rule of the Crevellan Empire. Velrith, the alien princess who had once been his enemy, now stood beside him, her face smeared with dirt and blood. Despite everything, despite the betrayals and the broken trust, they had managed to survive together. And somehow, against all odds, they had won. As they made their way through the battlefield, Ethan's heart felt heavy. He knew that many of the soldiers who had fought beside them wouldn't be coming back. Their sacrifices had paved the way for this victory. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There was still so much left to do, so much rebuilding to be done. The Crevellan Empire was shattered, but it wasn't gone. They still had a presence in the galaxy, and the war was not truly over until every last trace of the Empire was eradicated. But for now, the humans had a brief moment of peace. The victory belonged to them, and the Crevellan forces had been driven back. It was a victory that had come at a great price, but it was still a victory. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted when Velrith spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost distant, but there was a new tone in it, one that hadn't been there before. "You saved my life, Ethan," she said, her eyes meeting his. "If it wasn't for you, I would have died on that battlefield. You didn't have to help me, but you did. And because of that, we won." Ethan shook his head, not knowing how to respond. He wasn't a hero. He was just a medic who did his job, who helped those in need. "I didn't do it for you, Velrith," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And now, we've both fought for something bigger than ourselves." Velrith looked at him, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in her eyes. "You're right. But still, you saved me. And that means more to me than you'll ever understand." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. The battle was over, but there was still much to be done. The humans had won, but they had a long road ahead. Rebuilding their society would take time. The wounds of war were deep, and the scars would last for generations. As they walked away from the battlefield, the two of them side by side, Ethan could sense a change in the air. The fight was not over, but they had made a statement. The Crevellan Empire had underestimated humanity, and now they knew that humans were not to be taken lightly. The legacy of this victory would echo through the galaxy for years to come. The war may not have been finished, but the humans had proven that they could stand their ground. They had fought with courage, determination, and heart, and they had won. But more than that, they had proven that no matter how advanced the enemy, no matter how powerful the forces they faced, humanity would always find a way to survive. In the days that followed, Ethan stayed by Velrith's side. The two of them worked together to help the injured, to care for the wounded, and to ensure that the survivors had what they needed. It was a quiet, humbling time, but it was also a time for reflection. Ethan couldn't help but think about how far they had come, how much they had lost, and how much they had gained. The human resistance was rebuilding. The people were beginning to return to their homes, and the infrastructure was slowly being restored. It would take time, but there was hope now. For the first time in a long time, humanity had a future to look forward to. But even as the humans celebrated their victory, there were still whispers of the future. The Crevellan Empire was not gone. It would take years to fully dismantle their forces, to rid the galaxy of their influence. But the humans had made a start. They had stood up and fought for what was theirs, and they had won. Velrith, too, had changed. She had once been a pawn in the game of war, a princess torn between her loyalty to her people and her desire for freedom. But now, she stood beside humanity as an ally, a leader in her own right. She had found a new purpose, one that didn't involve conquest or subjugation. She had seen the strength of the human spirit, and it had inspired her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a part of something greater. She was part of a movement that was changing the galaxy, a movement that would one day bring about peace and unity. Ethan couldn't help but feel proud of her. He had once doubted her, feared that she would betray him again. But now, he saw the woman she had become, a woman who had fought for her people, a woman who had fought for the greater good. Together, they had made a difference. As the weeks passed, the humans continued to rebuild, and the galaxy began to change. The Crevellan forces were in disarray, their leadership shattered, and the remnants of their empire were scattered across the stars. But even in the face of this chaos, Ethan could see the glimmer of hope. There would be peace, eventually. The road would be long, but the humans had proven that they could survive. And together, they would shape the future. One day, as the sun set over the newly rebuilt city, Ethan stood with Velrith on the balcony, looking out at the horizon. The scars of war were still visible, but they were beginning to fade. The galaxy was healing, slowly but surely. "Do you think we'll ever have true peace?" Ethan asked, his voice soft. Velrith turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "I think we're closer than we've ever been, she said quietly. We've fought the hardest battle, and we've won. Now, it's time to rebuild, to unite, and to create a future that's worth fighting for. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time in a long time, he believed her. They had won. They had proved their strength, and now it was time to build something better. The victory had been hard-earned, but it had been worth every sacrifice. And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. The humans had a legacy now, one that would echo through the stars for generations to come. They had shown the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated, that they could fight, and that they would never give up. Humanity had won. And with that victory, they had earned their place in the galaxy.